process diagrams, map diagrams, there are 8 different that you have the task 1 and 35 about diagrams. Or you might get more, do better if they give. Let's have a look at an example. We've got the type. There are 8 different graphic types. You've got tables, line graphs, bar graphs, stacked bar graphs, pie charts, process diagrams, map diagrams, or you might get more than one graphic. Let's have a look at an example. They give themselves below that. So you should be going to look at the structure of this answer. Now notice, at the beginning we have the introduction, then below that we have an overview, and then we have body paragraphs. Now we need to make sure that we have at least 2 body paragraphs. Let's start with the introduction. When we're writing the introduction, what we do is we look at the rubric, the description of the graphic. We try to do 3 things. Use different words, also known as synonyms. We try to use different grammatical structures, and if there's a time period, then we try to change the description of the time period. Let's do one together. So let's look at the rubric now. It says the diagram below. So what synonyms do we have? Well, why don't we just say the process diagram? So the process diagram, and then we've got this word shows. A synonym for shows? Well, how about gives? The stages. Okay, well, let's look at the process diagram. How many stages are there? Well, there are 8 in total. And what is a synonym for stages? Steps. Gives the 8 steps. And then we've got involved in producing 1 bottle of wine. Let's change this. To make a single bottle of wine. Great. We've quickly written a high-scoring introduction. Let's try another. So again, we're going to look at the rubric, the description of the graphic, and we're going to change the words. The graph below. Okay, well, what kind of graphic is this? It's a line graph. So the line graph shows, how about, it gives a comparison of the favorite sport of people from the US. How about the favorite sport of US citizens between 1985 and 2015, from 1985 to 2015. Again, we've written a quick, high-scoring IELTS introduction. I want to give you a bit of a cheat sheet for this. When we're writing our introduction, we're going to first say the graphic type, so the table, the line graph, the bar graph, the pie chart, etc. And then we're going to use a verb, like shows, presents, gives, illustrates. We're just going to use a different verb than the one that appears in the rubric. And then we've got a description, like a comparison of the differences or the changes. And that's how we're going to quickly write our introduction. So by the end of it, it'll look a bit like this. The table shows a comparison of the number of students studying abroad from 8 countries in 2005 and 2015. Great. So we've covered how to write introductions, and we now know we can do this quickly. Let's focus on the overview. Let's look at our process diagram again and think about what we should include in an overview for this graphic type. By the way, the overview is a general understanding of the graphic type. So we don't need to include data. We don't need to include any dates. We just need to talk about roughly what's happening. What I would recommend for a process diagram is that you include these things. First, you should include the number of steps, how the process starts, how the process ends, and any other key features about this graphic. So let's do that together. First of all, how many steps are there? Well, there are 8 steps in total. What's the beginning? Well, it starts with picking grapes. And how does it end? It ends with the bottle of wine going to the supermarket. Now, are there any features? Take a second, you can pause the video and study this graphic. Are there any features that you would like to point out that you think are important to understanding this graphic? Well, I picked out 2 features. I thought the fact that there are 400 grapes needed to make 1 bottle of wine, that's important, and that waste is composted at 3 separate stages. Now, if you didn't include these extra features, you can still get a top score for your overview. However, by adding these features, you're really showing the examiner that you understand the graphic. So now let's write our overview. We're first going to include the number of steps. So let's say something like, overall, producing and transporting 1 bottle of wine is an 8-stage process. Brilliant. By the way, do you notice that I start the overview with overall? I recommend starting all overviews with overall because it makes it very clear to the examiner that you have an overview. By the way, most examiners, when they start writing your academic task 1, or when they start marking it, the first thing they do is look for an overview. So make it easy for them to see it. Write overall, and then a comma, and then have your overview. So we've covered how many steps there are. We're now going to look at the start. So we can say something like, which starts from picking the grapes. Easy. Now we're going to mention how it ends, and ends with sending the bottle to the supermarket. Perfect. So this would already be getting a top score as an overview. However, we're going the extra mile. We're going to mention some key features. We're going to mention the 400 grapes first. 400 grapes are needed to produce one bottle, and let's also mention that waste is composted, and waste is created at 3 stages of this process. Bingo, that is a band 9 overview. Let's look at a different graphic now. This is a very typical graphic in that we have data and how it changes over time. The overview can be slightly more complex, but it's not impossible. I'm going to show you how to do it now. So in the overview, I would recommend that you find out which trends increase, which trends decrease, and again, any particular features. So which trends increase? Well, if we look at American football, we can see that it increases. Basketball also increases, and other sports increase. What about the decreasing trends? Well, baseball decreases, hockey decreases. Now, are there any particular features that would help to boost our overview? Well, how about this? American football is always the most favorite. So from 1985 to 2015, American football is the favorite sport, and I would mention that in the overview. We've also got this interesting feature here. Basketball becomes the second most favorite. So I'm going to mention that in the overview. So let's write it together. We're going to first focus on which trends increased. So overall, 3 sports became more popular: American football, basketball, and other sports. Notice I start my overview with overall and then a comma, and then I talk about which sports increase in brackets. That's a great idea. Now I'm going to mention which trends decrease. And 2 sports became less popular: baseball and hockey. Perfect. This is already a very good overview, but we're going to improve it by adding these features. Let's talk about the fact that American football is always the favorite. While American football consistently remained the most popular sport, and now let's mention basketball becoming the second, baseball was overtaken by basketball, which became the second most popular. Brilliant. This is a great overview. Now I want to give you some notes about how to write a brilliant overview. First, I would recommend that you spend 4 minutes before you start writing, analyzing the graphic. Think about what you're going to include in your overview, and also think about what order you're going to use in explaining the information. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a second. I'd recommend that you first write the introduction and then the overview after. And by writing the overview, this will give you an idea of how you're going to structure your body paragraphs. Start your overview with overall and then a comma. Make it easy for the examiner to know you're writing an overview. And then let's look at some different graphic types. If the graphic shows a trend over time, like the graphic we just looked at, write about how the trends change. That in the overview. So let's write it together. We're going to first focus on which trends increased. So overall, 3 sports became more popular: American football, basketball, and other sports. Notice I start my overview with overall and then a comma, and then I talk about which sports increase in brackets. That's a great idea. Now I'm going to mention which trends decrease. And 2 sports became less popular: baseball and hockey. Perfect. This is already a very good. That's a great idea. Now I'm going to mention which trends decrease. And 2 sports became less popular: baseball and hockey. Perfect. This is already a very good overview, but we're going to improve it by adding these features. Let's talk about the fact that American football is always the favorite. While American football consistently remained the most popular sport, and now let's mention basketball becoming the second. Baseball was overtaken by basketball, which became the second most popular. Brilliant. This is a great overview. Now I want to give you some notes about how to write a brilliant overview. First, I would recommend that you spend 4 minutes before you start writing, analyzing the graphic. Think about what you're going to include in your overview, and also think about what order you're going to use in explaining the information. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a second. I'd recommend that you first write the introduction and then the overview after. And by writing the overview, this will give you an idea of how you're going to structure your body paragraphs. Start your overview with overall and then a comma. Make it easy for the examiner to know you're writing an overview. And then let's look at some different graphic types. If the graphic shows a trend over time, like the graphic we just looked at, write about how the trends change from the beginning to the end of the period. If the graphic has a prediction for the future, for example, the year 2050, then I would mention how the predictions are the same or different from the previous information. Again, if you're not sure about this, I would recommend that you practice this graphic type before you go to your IELTS writing test. Now, if the graphic is a process diagram, like turning the grapes into wine, the graphic we looked at earlier, mention how many steps there are, what happened at the beginning and the end, and then mention any key stages or any key details that you think are important for understanding this graphic. Now, if the graphic is a map diagram, which is also common in Academic Task 1, then you've got 2 options. Either mention all the similarities and differences between the 2 maps, or you can describe how the second map is different. So you can say, for example, if it's 2 houses, you can say the new house is bigger, or the new house has more rooms, or the new house is smaller. Try to use objective adjectives to describe how new map is different. I would recommend that you practice writing lots of overviews before your IELTS writing test. Get IELTS books and just look at every single Academic Task 1 and write an overview for each one. If you get the overview incorrect, it's very difficult to get band 7 or above. You need to be learning how to write accurate overviews. And the best way to do that is to practice, practice, practice. So we've now covered the introduction and we've covered the overview. Let's look at how we're going to write body paragraphs. The most important thing is that you have logical paragraphs. So if we had a graphic like this, our process diagram, there's kind of 2 ways that we could logically organize our report. Idea 1 is that we have body paragraph 1, which looks at stages 1 to 3, so it ends with fermentation. And the reason I'd stop there is because we've got that phrase 2 weeks later, so it shows that there's a period of time, there's a lag, and that makes it a logical place to stop a paragraph. Therefore, in paragraph 2, I'd maybe have stages 4 to 5, which ends with going into the barrels. Again, this is where there would be a pause in the time because the wine needs to sit in the barrels for a long period of time. And then finally, in paragraph 3, we would have stages 7 and 8, which are the last 2 stages. However, we could also have a second way of organizing this. We could have stages 1 to 6, which ends with barrels, and then finally stages 7 to 8. The examiner needs to see that you've organized your paragraphs logically. It's also And then finally in paragraph 3, we would have stages 7 and 8, which are the last two stages. However, we could also have a second way of organizing this. We could have stages 1 to 6, which ends with barrels, and then finally stages 7 to 8. The examiner would have a second way of why needs to sit in the stages 4 to 5, which end with going into the barrels. Again, this is where there would be a pause in the time because the Y needs to sit in the barrels for a long period of time. And then finally in paragraph 3, we would have stages 7 and 8, which are the last two stages. However, we could also have a second way of organizing this. We could have stages 1 to 6, which ends with barrels, and then finally stages 7 to 8. The examiner needs to see that you've organized your paragraphs logically. It's also very important for stages 1 to 6, which ends with barrels, and then finally stages 7 to 8. The examiner needs to have a second way of organizing this. We could have stages 1 to 6, which ends with barrels, and then finally stages 7 to 8. The examiner needs to see that you've organized your paragraphs logically. It's also very important that you have at least two body paragraphs. Don't try to put all of the information just in one paragraph. So what happens if we have a graphic like this? Again, let's think about some logical ways to organize our paragraphs. Well, here's one way we could organize it. We can have paragraph 1, which shows the sports that have increased in popularity. Paragraph 2, that shows the sports that have decreased in popularity. Brilliant. Or here's another idea. We could have the most popular sports in the first paragraph, and in the second paragraph, we could have the least popular sports. It's not like one of these will get a better score. The examiner in both cases will see that you looked at the graphic and decided logically how to organize the information. Now what we're going to do is write a band 9 answer for this graphic. We're going to do it sentence by sentence. Now we've done the introduction and overview already, but we'll just do that again. So our introduction. The line graph compares the favorite sports of US citizens from 1985 to 2015. So that was easy. Remember, we just took that information from the rubric and we changed the wording. Then we write the overview. Overall, 3 sports have become more popular: American football, basketball, and other sports, and 2 sports became less popular: baseball and hockey. While American football consistently remained the most popular sport, baseball was overtaken by basketball, which became the second most popular. Brilliant overview. We now move to the body paragraphs. Now remember, we're going to have at least 2 body paragraphs. Let's look at body paragraph 1. Now, I always recommend that you start and 2 sports became less popular: baseball and hockey. While American football consistently remained the most popular sport, baseball was overtaken by basketball, which became the second most popular. Brilliant overview. We now move to the body paragraphs. Now remember, overall, 3 sports have become more popular: American football, basketball, and other sports, and 2 sports became less popular: baseball and hockey. While American football consistently remained the most popular sport, baseball was overtaken by basketball, which became the second most popular. Brilliant overview. We now move to the body paragraphs. Now remember, we're going to have at least 2 body paragraphs. Let's look at body paragraph 1. Now, I always recommend that you start each body paragraph with a short sentence that makes it very clear to the examiner what they will read about in that paragraph. This is called a topic sentence. Here's an example. The sports that increased in popularity are American football, basketball, and other sports. Now, this is a short sentence, and as soon as the examiner reads this, they know that in this paragraph, they're going to read about sports that increased in popularity, and those sports are American football, basketball, and other sports. Here's the second sentence. American football was the favorite throughout the period. Another short sentence that tells the examiner that we're first looking at American football. Now that I've said that about American football, maybe I'm going to include some more details about American football. From 1985 to 2000, its popularity hovered between 36% and 38% before increasing to over 40% in 2005, where it remained until 2015. Brilliant. We've got more information about American football, and in this sentence, we include a lot of data. We've got hovered between 36% and 38%, increasing to over 40%, and then the fact that it remains there from 2005 to 2015. This sentence is full of accurate and useful data for describing what happens to American football. Now, remember, in this paragraph, we're looking at American football, basketball, and other sports. So when we move on to talk about basketball, we need to make that very clear to the examiner. Look at this sentence. Basketball, which started as the 3rd most popular sport at 15%, dipped slightly before rising steeply to over 20% in 2000. Great. We make it very clear that we've finished talking about American football and we're now talking about basketball. Let's include some more information about basketball. There was a second dip in 2005, after which there was a decade of consistent increase, meaning that basketball overtook baseball as the second most popular. By the way, you'll notice there was a second dip in 2005, after which there was a decade of consistent increase, meaning that basketball overtook baseball as the second most popular. By the way, you'll notice that there's a lot of vocabulary that possibly you don't know in this answer. In this lesson, we're not going to cover the vocabulary, we're going to do that in a future lesson, but maybe if it's helpful, have a think about what some of this vocabulary means. Now, we've covered American football, we've covered basketball, we now need to look at other sports. So let's do that. Finally, other sports rose rather consistently throughout the period despite a slight drop in 2000. Now notice we have the word finally, comma, and then we introduce the final category. Brilliant. Using a word like finally clearly shows the examiner that you're dealing with one category at a time. Let's look at body paragraph 2. Now, if body paragraph 1 was looking at the sports that have... Using a word like finally clearly shows the examiner that you're dealing with one category at a time. Let's look at body paragraph 2. Now, if body paragraph 1 was looking at the sports that have increased in popularity, what does the examiner think they will read about in body paragraph 2? They expect to read about the sports that have decreased in popularity. So we're going to say that very clearly in our topic sentence. Baseball and hockey became less popular. The next sentence will logically tell the examiner about baseball. Baseball was the second most popular sport at the beginning, just under 35% in 1985. However, its popularity declined, resulting in baseball becoming the third most popular sport by 2015. Now we're going to talk about hockey. A less dramatic decrease can be seen with hockey. Between 1985 and 2015, it fell around 6%. That's a great advanced phrase. A less dramatic decrease can be seen with hockey. Now, why is this so good? It's good because it's comparing baseball and hockey. It's saying baseball went down a lot. There's a less dramatic decrease in hockey. And now we give more information about hockey. To be more specific, it stayed at approximately 10% until about 1995, after which it began to drop consistently until finally reaching 5% by 2015. So here is our model. It stayed at approximately 10% until about 1995. After which it began to drop consistently until finally reaching 5% by 2015. So here is our model answer in its entirety, and I want to show you a bit about why this would get such a high score. First of all, you'll notice it's way over 150 words. Unfortunately, guys, if you're aiming for band 8 and 9, you need to be writing a lot of words because you need to include a lot of information and analysis about the graphic. So there are 4 criteria you're assessed on. The first is task achievement. Now, the examiner will be looking, do you cover all of the categories? Yes. So all of the categories being all of the sports, American football, hockey, baseball, basketball, and other sports. This answer includes information about all of them. There's a clear introduction which uses synonyms. There's a clear overview starting with overall. We've made it clear to the examiner that we have an overview by using overall and then comma. We use data from the graphic to support our statements. The data that we choose is accurately represented. Top score for task achievement. What about coherence and cohesion? Well, this is about how you organize your answer. The answer is divided into logical paragraphs. Remember, body paragraph 1 is all the sports that have increased in popularity, and body paragraph 2 is all the sports that have decreased in popularity. The information is logically divided within each paragraph. So remember, in each paragraph, I started by talking about one sport and then moved on to the other sport. That's logical. I started talking about American football and then I moved on to basketball. So this makes it very easy for the examiner to read and understand what data is being selected on which category. Each body paragraph starts with a clear topic sentence. Remember, I said these topic sentences are often a little bit shorter and shows the examiner exactly what they will read about in this answer. And then there are linking words like finally and however. Again, more about that in a future lesson. The next category is lexical resource. This means vocabulary. So there's lots of good topic-specific vocabulary, things like rose steeply and second most popular. There's not too much repetition of the same words or phrases. If, for example, you're using the word increase dramatically multiple times throughout your essay, you could get a lower score. There are no spelling mistakes as well. That's important. Finally, the examiner will also assess you on grammatical range and accuracy. So this is your grammar. Now, in particular, they're looking at 3 things. Do you have a range of grammatical structures? Yes, we've got simple sentences, complex sentences, relative clauses. We've got everything in this answer. Is that grammar accurate? In this case, yes, it is. And finally, is the punctuation, things like commas and colons and full stops, are they accurately used? Yes, they are. I want to give you a quick summary. Grammar accurate? In this case, yes, it is. And finally, is the punctuation, things like commas and colons and full stops, are they accurately used? Yes, they are. I want to give you a quick summary before you leave. So in today's lesson, we've learned that before your writing test, you need to practice all the graphic types. I really recommend that, just practice all the graphic types. You should experiment with different timings. For example, maybe spending 25 minutes on task 1 and 35 minutes on task 2. You need to learn how to write more than 150 words. You should spend 4 minutes analyzing the graphic before you start writing and think about what you're going to include in your overview and how you're going to order your report. You should write your introduction first. And when you do this, you're changing the words. You're using synonyms from the rubric. Then you write your overview, and that starts with overall and then a comma. A good idea is to practice writing lots of overviews for different tasks. You can find that in this. Then you write your overview, and that starts with overall and a comma. A good idea is to practice writing lots of overviews for different tasks. You can find that in this kind of book, the Cambridge Past Papers. Divide the information into logical paragraphs. You need to make a decision about what should be in each paragraph and make sure that you write about each category. Don't, for example, forget to talk about American football. This will dramatically lower your score. Start each paragraph with a clear topic sentence. The sentence is often shorter. And then within each paragraph, divide the information into a logical sequence. For example, starting talking about American football and then basketball and then other sports. Finally, make sure it is clear what you are writing about, and so you can use linking words like finally and however to do that. Okay, this has been a very comprehensive video. Football